Hello and welcome back to Shakesyear. We are working on the Merry Wives of Windsor, and today we get to hear from Falstaff in Act 3, Scene 5. But whoops, yesterday we just finished Act 3, Scene 2, in which we had Ford angry with himself because he has given this money to Falstaff, who's supposed to go and try to woo his wife. Falstaff is supposed to go to Mistress Ford's house, or the Ford's house, between 10 and 11 so that he can woo her and hopefully get some of her money, hopefully from his perspective. But Mistress Ford and Mistress Page and Mistress Quickly are like hatching a plot to make an idiot out of Falstaff. And also everybody is in love with Anne Page. Caius and Evans were supposed to have dueled, but the host of the Garter Inn told them to meet at different places so that they wouldn't actually have to duel. So they didn't duel, and when they got together, they were like, we don't really want to duel, so let's just get back at the host instead. So they want to pull some sort of prank on the host. Mistresses Ford and Quickly are going to pull some sort of prank on Falstaff. Falstaff thinks that he's going to go get some and also get some money. And Mr. Ford is feeling a bit like an idiot. Mr. Page is just like, yeah, I trust my wife. She's not going to sleep with anybody else. So Act 3, Scene 3 is where things get farcical. It's really fun. We are at the Ford's house, and we start out with Mistress Ford and Mistress Page, and they're both there, and they give instructions to the servants. They're like, remember, when we give the word, you're going to take this basket, leave the house, and dump it by the river, no questions asked. And the servants are like, yep, no problem. And then the servants leave, and Mistress Page is like, okay, I'm gonna go hide, and if I miss my cue, like, just give me a signal. So she goes and hides, and Falstaff comes in, and he proceeds to start to woo Mistress Ford, which is kind of sad and pathetic the way that he goes about it. It's overt and obvious and not very romantic or sexy. But after a little while, Robin, who, remember, Robin actually works for Falstaff, but he had gone at Mistress Page's request to chat with her for a little while, so he's actually kind of in on it. He comes in and he's like, oh my goodness, Mistress Page is at the back door and she has news. So Falstaff is like, oh, I'm gonna hide, because he doesn't want Mistress Page to see him at Mistress Ford's house, because he still plans to hook up with Mistress Page at some point. So he like hides behind the curtains, and Mistress Page comes in and she's like, oh no, your husband is nearby and he's coming, and he's bringing all of these people with him because he heard that you have a man in the house. And not to cast aspersions, but if you do have a man in the house, you should get him out of the house, because if your husband finds another man in the house, he's going to kill him. And Mistress Ford is like, oh no, I actually do have a man in the house, and I don't want him to get killed by my husband, who is so vengeful. And they're doing this whole like show for Falstaff's sake while Falstaff is behind the curtain. They're like, but how could we possibly get him out? And Mistress Page is like, well, here's this basket, but if Falstaff wasn't so big, maybe he could fit in this basket, and then we could sneak him out as if he were laundry. And Mistress Ford is like, no, he's way too big for the basket. And Falstaff comes out from behind the curtain. He's like, let me see the basket, because now he's afraid for his life. So he gets in this basket, and they put a bunch of laundry on him. They call the two serving boys in who've been given instructions about this basket. But then Mr. Ford and everybody else, all of the ones that he was able to get to come with him, which is like Caius and Evans and the host, they all come in. Oh, and Mr. Page. And they all are like, where are you going with that basket? And the boys are like, it's laundry. We're taking it to the laundry woman. And he's like, all right, fine. So they leave with the basket with Falstaff in it, with dirty laundry on top of him. They all leave. Mr. Ford proceeds to conduct a search of the house. He tells everybody to search the house. He makes a show of like locking the door so that anybody that's in can't possibly get out. So they do this whole big search of the house, and while they're doing that, the ladies are like, this is super fun, and like, your husband's gonna look like an idiot. Mrs. Ford is like, yeah, and it's fun to sort of make him look like an idiot, so maybe we should do some more of this later, and let's play another trick on Falstaff too. So let's get Falstaff to come back at like 8, something like that, maybe 8 o'clock tonight, and we can pull another prank on him, and oh, won't that be fun? And meantime, they've completed the search of the house. They don't find anybody there. Mr. Page and Caius and the host and Evans are all like, we're just gonna mock you for a long time, Mr. Ford. And Mr. Ford invites them all to dinner. Mr. Page invites them all to breakfast the next day so that they can keep mocking Mr. Ford. And a bunch of them go off to dinner, except for Caius and Evans, who are like, and also remember, we need to get back at the host. And that's the end of Act 3, Scene 3. It's very big and farcical and fun. Act 3, Scene 4, we have Fenton talking to Anne Page, and they're doing like the cutesy lovers thing, but he's like, your father will never accept me, and she's like, oh, but we'll do what we can, and yada yada. But then Slender and Shallow and somebody, was Evans at the other place? Anyway, at minimum Slender and Shallow come in, and they're like, excuse me, Anne Page, we need to speak with you. And Fenton goes over and talks with Mistress Quickly for a minute, and he's like, you know, do I have a shot? And Mistress Quickly's like, yeah, well, we'll try, we'll do what we can for you. And Slender is supposed to be wooing Anne Page, but Shallow is actually doing all of the talking. So any question that Anne Page asks, Shallow answers on behalf of Slender, until finally Anne Page is like, could he woo me for himself, please? And Shallow's like, oh yeah, that's a good idea. And he leaves. So the two of them get to talk for a minute. And she's like, actually, you know, what do you want from me? And Slender's like, nothing, really. I'm doing this because they said that I'm supposed to. And if you choose me, then like, great. But if you don't, like, that's great too. And which I think sets Mistress Anne's mind a little bit at ease, because she doesn't necessarily like him all that much. She'd rather be with Fenton. So Shallow and Slender eventually leave, and Mistress Page comes in. Mistress Quickly is like, says to Fenton, you should talk to Mistress Page, see if you can get in her good graces. So he does. He's like, could you put in a good word for me? And Mistress Page is like, you know, I'll do what I can, but I'm going to defer to what my daughter wants. I'm not going to make her marry somebody that she doesn't want to, so let me talk to her first and see what that's all about. And they essentially leave, and Mistress Quickly gets a moment by herself at the end where she's like, well, I'm rooting for him, and I'm rooting for him, and I'm rooting for him, because I said that I was going to. I said that I would help all three of them to woo Anne Page, but really, I kind of hope that Fenton gets her. And that's the end of Act 3, Scene 4. So finally, here we are in Act 3, Scene 5, where we are at the inn, the Garter Inn, post farcical encounter at the Ford's house, and Falstaff calls to Bardolph. He's like, Bardolph? And Bardolph says yes, and Falstaff says, go fetch me a quart of sack, put a toast in it. Bardolph leaves. Have I lived to be carried in a basket like a barrow of butcher's offal, and to be thrown in the Thames? Well, if I be served such another trick, I'll have my brains taken out and buttered and give them to the dog for a New Year's gift. The rogues slighted me into the river with as little remorse as they would have drowned a blind bitch's puppies, 15 in the litter. And you may know by my size that I have a kind of alacrity in sinking. If the bottom were as deep as hell, I should down. I had been drowned, but that the shore was shelvy and shallow. Death that I abhor, for the water swells a man, and what a thing should I have been when I had been swelled. I should have been a mountain of mummy. So he's recounting what happened to him from his position. He orders a beer and some toast, and Bardolph goes off, and then he's like, this is ridiculous that they went and they just threw me in the river the same way that they would have drowned a bunch of dogs that they don't want. And he's saying that he's particularly afraid of drowning because if a person drowns, the water tends to swell the body, and he's a rather large man to begin with. So imagine what he would look like if he was swelled up, and he has a tendency to sink, so he would definitely drown if the shore had not been kind of rocky and he was able to climb his way out. So he was not a fan of getting dumped in the river, and he's like, they're not going to make an idiot of me again. Ha ha, ha ha the day. But Bardolph then comes back with his drink, and Mistress Quickly comes in because she has some follow-up for him, and there's a little bit more ordering with Bardolph before we get to the conversation with Falstaff and Mistress Quickly, which is a good place to stop for today and pick it up for tomorrow. So I will see you then, where we see what new news Mistress Quickly has for Falstaff. Mwah.